So, hey everyone, this is Yash Joshi. Uh, Greetings from India. So, I would be presenting on the fetch ID attribute, which is a proposed addition to the resource timing API. So, let's get started with the definition first. This is basically fetch ID is a unique identifier that we aim to associate with each resource fetch and their corresponding resource timing entry. A detailed explainer doc has been attached with the slides for you all to have a look at that. We discussed about the needs and merits for such a attribute previously in the resource timing repository. Feel free to check out the detailed discussion there. Just to sum it up, the major use case was that this fetch ID attribute will aim to serve as a solid basis for us to build the initiator attributes. This initiator attribute will also be a part of the resource timing entry, which will basically hold the fetch ID of the parent resource that initiated its fetch. This will basically help us establish clear connection between the resources and their initiators, ultimately helping the identification of parent resources that triggered the fetch of a particular resource. This will ultimately help us in the dependency tree creation and enable detailed analysis by RUM providers with regards to identifying, with regards to optimizing the resource loading and identifying the third-party scripts that may be loading a lot more resources, or identifying resources that are on critical path to LCP. Uh, these are the major use cases that we could identify for this given attribute. Talking about the proposed API endpoint shape, we aim to add a read-only type attribute of fetch ID to the existing interface of the performance resource timing. This will be of type DOM string. The example uses the uses for this type of a resource, this type of attribute is very similar to how we utilize the other components of a resource timing entry, such as a response code or response status or any other part. It will be very similar to how we utilize them. The talking about the main characteristic requirements for this kind of a ID is first is uniqueness, where so that we can differentiate between different resource fetches and their corresponding resource timing entries. And second is some amount of randomness to prevent any pattern or correlation that may hamper the overall integrity of the project, just to be on the safer side. Talking about implementation, we think that utilizing the random UID method that is already specified in the web cryptography API can be a great candidate for implementing this kind of a fetch ID, because this invoking this method basically generates a version 4 universally unique identifier that can basically serve as a fetch ID for our case, as it satisfies both the desired characteristics that are part of the fetch ID. Moving forward, the major spec changes required are first the major spec changes are required in the resource timing spec. With regards to, we need to modify the interface to reflect the new fetch ID attribute, and also modify the basic whole process of setting up a resource timing entry to add a step for setting the fetch ID as well. The fetch spec will also be need to be updated to reflect the new fetch ID attribute and have elaboration of how we aim to derive this attribute. Uh, Moving forward, there are a few ideas that are still up for debate, and we would really appreciate your views on them. The first idea pertains to the fact that whether multiple fetches to the same resource or a range of requests to a particular resource, such as, say, a large audio or video file, should carry a same fetch ID, or all these fetches to a particular resource should have different fetch IDs. We believe having a same fetch ID will simplify the creation of these dependency trees and avoid any unnecessary confusions that may hamper the creation of these dependency trees. This creation of dependency trees has been the major goal of this project, so we believe that we should aim for this. And as you have correctly pointed out, the answer to this question will ultimately decide whether we want to call this attribute fetch ID in itself or resource ID. The second idea pertains to the fact that we need to come up with the right mechanism for passing this attribute from fetch to the resource timing entry. Currently, fetch timing info is the struct that holds that all the timing related information that we need to pass from fetch to a resource timing entry. It also holds the render blocking status of a particular resource timing entry. We believe that it will be a suitable candidate for holding this fetch ID attribute as well. Just wanting to know the working group's views on this. The last is a very important part that we are still struggling to come up with a particular answer. Whether there should be a fetch ID or a resource ID for a navigation timing entry as well. This can be useful in cases where the fetch for a particular resource is not initiated by another resource as such, but basically the fetch has been initiated by, say, tags, HTML tags such as link tag initiating a fetch request or an image tag initiating a fetch request from the base HTML document. So in that case, we have either two options as of now. We can either use initiator. We can either set the initiator value for these elements as null, or we can basically utilize the fetch ID or resource ID that we are generating for the navigation timing entry to be utilized here. Using a navigation time, using a fetch ID or a resource ID for navigation timing entries will basically ensure that the dependency tree is not a bunch of disconnected graph, but basically they are basically a connected tree. So that is something that we need to come up that we need to decide upon. Also, if we go for null, it would be we would be skipping the explicit checks that we need to comparison that we need to check, because a null will simply implicate to the run provider that the browser is not sure of which element basically initiated the fetch request. So that is something that we need to decide. And that's all from my side. Thank you all for tuning in, and would love to know your views on the same and answer any queries that you all may have. Thank you.